to rehabilitate Keynes. Keynes was perhaps the most famous economist of the 20th century, arguably of all time. What did he do? He looked at economics, he worked out that the economic theory they had just wasn't fit for purpose, and he then got the basics right. He understood business cycles, he understood that people make decisions using rules of thumb, not mathematical calculations. He understood the real importance of business confidence, or what he called animal spirits. But he didn't take this revolution far enough. He formulated a theory that left out what he knew were key drivers, such as spirits. And he did that in order, because it's difficult to formulate what appear to be slightly fuzzy concepts like animal spirits, and he knew it would make it less acceptable to existing economists. And then he found, because he left out some bits, then he needed to add some other dodgy concepts like the multiplier, liquidity preference, in order to make his model actually work. Now, his prescriptions for economic actions continue to be used to this day. When we have recessions, governments typically go in and spend to try and pull us out of a hole. But his underlying theory has been discarded. It's not used. The name Keynesianism has come to be attached to a completely different, and in fact, continuing old-fashioned classical approach to economics, which is unrealistic and doesn't work. We now have policy actions, but without the real theoretical underpinnings that should be giving rise to them. As I say, it's time to rehabilitate the real Keynes, the Keynes of the opinions he expressed, rather than the Keynes of the slightly arcane workings he put down in his general theory. To understand what Keynes was up against, we'll just briefly revisit the classical economics. The classical school of economics held that there was the invisible hand of the market, which was going to make everything work out. Individual greed was fine because the invisible hand of the market would transmute it to the gold of social perfection. It would work out to be good for everyone. Essentially, this was an updated view of the philosophical position that Voltaire satirized several hundred years ago, that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. That the economy will automatically adjust to keep itself on the best possible path: growth, full employment. The evidence is obviously against that picture, but that's what people like to believe, and in many cases it's what people still do believe. Of the classical economic view is what's called equilibrium. The fact is that nobody really knows what they mean by equilibrium, but the idea is that if you disturb the economy, it suffers a shock of some sort, then it will swing right back to where it was, because it's self-adjusting, self-normalizing. Everything goes back to being for the best.
The orthodox view that Keynes now challenged assumed that the economy works on an autopilot, so that if it is jolted off course by shocks to the system, resulting in depression and unemployment, it soon recovers its equilibrium, thus restoring full employment.
And this also has the quite a large advantage from a theoretical mathematical point of view, that if you can assume that the economy is fundamentally in equilibrium, that it only ever deviates because of shocks slightly from some equilibrium position, you don't have to worry about economies crashing or economies taking off in unrealistic flights of growth. According to an equilibrium model, that simply never happens. That does make the modelling a lot easier. Keynes produced two major sources of writing in his lifetime. The first was called the Treatise, and the second, and the one that he's best known by today, the general theory. Unfortunately, these two books are not completely consistent, and Keynes wrote in a style that was very convoluted and not necessarily easy to follow. It seems that he did this because he thought deeply about most of these issues, and he had a lot of different thoughts in his mind at one point. He knew that the causal chains underlying economic outcomes were complicated, they're not simplistic, and he was trying to express this by putting many sorts of caveats and conditions around his thoughts as he wrote them down. But this doesn't make it particularly easy to follow or to know exactly what he means at any given moment. Essentially, Keynes came up with 4 fundamental insights. First, the economy will not automatically adjust to give optimal conditions. That is, it won't automatically work itself towards good growth, markets clearing, full employment, and other such things.
That a shock to investment set up a chain of repercussions on income and employment, which causes output as a whole to fall to a lower level and stay there until something stimulating occurs. The national income falls as unemployment rises, so less output can be bought. Output is curtailed to the point at which it can all be bought by the reduced incomes of the community, and that causes savings to fall until it's equal to the reduced volume of investment.
Second, uncertainty plagues everything in our lives. So, in particular, people don't make calculated, totally rational decisions. They rely instead upon rules of thumb, upon following others, and upon spirits, animal spirits, confidence. Confidence rules everything in economics. Thirdly, business cycles are the natural outcomes of people borrowing, investing, building up debt, having to pay interest. They're not, as the classical economists were forced to assume, only things that occur when an outside shock hits the economy, causing a cycle. No. According to Keynes, they were, as economists say, endogenous. They were caused by the operations of the economy itself in its normal way.
So here's how the theory goes. Incomes are earned producing output. According to pre-Keynesian orthodoxy, all earnings are spent, either in buying consumption goods or in buying investment goods. People's propensity to consume, the fraction of their income or earnings that they spend on consumption, that is reasonably stable. While saving depends on habit and precaution, investment depends on conventions, such as the belief that the future will be very much like the past, on animal spirits, and on a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction. And these are needed to get investment going, because investment is such an uncertain business. Right? If the animal spirits are dimmed and the spontaneous optimism falters, leaving us to depend on nothing but a mathematical expectation, enterprise will fade and die.
And fourthly, because the economy is not self-adjusting to a perfect optimum, and because business cycles are a natural feature of economies, governments need to step in order to ameliorate the bad effects of recessions, generally by introducing some government spending. Now, these 4 insights conflict with the underlying ideas of classical economics.
It's about how to do economics, whether economics is any good. And this was the failed paradigm shift, if you like. What Keynes did was to criticize the economics profession for modeling, creating models on the basis of unreal assumptions.
So, of course, classical economists attacked Keynes' theories and attempted to disregard them.
At the end, well, not the end, there was a period just after he'd written the general theory where he was so convinced he'd redone the whole science that he was rather contemptuous of anything which had been done before.
And it's perfectly true that, as we've said, the general theory is not particularly clearly written, and indeed was constructed to support his policy ideas of government intervention in markets. And this involved introducing some mechanisms which are perhaps less clear and less evidence-based than we'd like, such as the thing called the multiplier, which is there to stop the economy from simply crashing, declining to zero.
What is to stop industrial production sliding down an icy hill all the way to inactivity? Well, that is the function of the theory of the multiplier. And the calculation which showed that an economy faced with a shock would not run down to zero.
And, most importantly, he avoided trying to model the key behavioural characteristics that he himself had already identified. And those key behavioural characteristics were the use of heuristics, rules of thumb, to make economic decisions, and the important role of confidence in driving investment and spending. When it was introduced, and increasingly after his death, Keynes' underlying theory, particularly that expressed in the general theory, went out of fashion with economists. Classical economists continued to develop their models, and they tended to fix on simplistic models. Such things as monetarism, simple views of how things happen. If you can control the money supply, you won't have any inflation. It was tried in the last century, and of course it didn't work. Other formalistic ideas, such as that people have a perfect view of how economies work and can see into the future and will make totally rational and calculated decisions on that basis, this is known as rational expectations, are built into most current economic models. Obviously, this has nothing to do with real life. But it's much easier to write papers based on neat mathematical theories, however irrelevant, than it is to try and tackle the real behaviour of real economies. Keynes' insights about the real behaviour of the economy remain valid. They just haven't been properly modelled, not even by Keynes himself. Obviously, it is difficult to model states of mind and behaviours. They're changeable, they differ from person to person, they're subjective, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It's not impossible to model these things mathematically. We just need to start from Keynes' underlying insights, and we need to bring a fresh set of eyes to look at them. We cannot be constrained by existing economic theories or by the beliefs of the old classical economists. We have to look at real life and model Keynes's original ideas as he proposed them. Now, the easiest way to do this, to see if it's going to work, is to start with a toy model of the economy. We won't try to build anything that resembles the real complex economy with all its different people, its different goods, its different countries, all of its interactions, far too complex. We will try to build a toy economy which will just be sufficiently detailed to show how Keynes' ideas work without introducing lots of obfuscating factors which can get in the way of understanding. So, the economy we will model will be a closed economy, no international trade. It will produce just one product. It will have a population that receives its income every period from the spending that the population carried out in the previous period. So money will go around in circles, but they can also borrow some additional cash from a bank, or they can decide to save and put some of their income back into the bank. Once they've decided how much they're actually going to spend, that will be divided between consumption spending, stuff to eat, stuff to wear, and investment spending, what can be produced in future periods. And that decision on both on how much to spend and on how much to invest versus how much to consume will depend upon the amount of debt you have at the moment and on the level of confidence or spirits. Now, if you borrow, it means you're going to pay an interest rate, and that's basically going to be a little bit above the current rate of inflation, and how much above will depend upon the ratio of debt to income. Now, this toy economy obviously doesn't have important features of a real economy. For example, it doesn't distinguish between firms and labour. It doesn't have employment or unemployment. It doesn't have a government. It doesn't have tax. It doesn't have different goods competing amongst themselves, and so on and so on. Further, when we make equations that describe the way people take decisions and behave in this economy, that is, how we mathematize the rules of the economy, these rules are extremely simple. So, just to take an example, when we're modelling confidence, you'd expect the degree of economic confidence to depend upon a number of things: the GDP, the inflation rate, the interest rate, debt levels, recent trends of GDP and these other factors, as well as other things. But in our toy model, we're just going to say, let's take one of those, the level of GDP, and that's what will determine the change in the spirits. So once we've taken these elements and written down our very simple behaviour rules, we can take those equations and put them into a spreadsheet. Spirits, or confidence, is an important component of this model, and the way in which spirits are modelled is that at each period, if the economy is doing well, then spirits will increase. So if the economy continues to do well, even at the same level, spirits over time will get higher and higher. So spirits can be divorced from the actual underlying performance of the economy. And that's key to giving the level of confidence that's needed to kickstart investment. Otherwise, if spirits simply tracked the performance of the economy, then if the economy was flat, spirits would be flat, there'd be no reason to actually do anything.
By the way, for anyone interested in the details, there's a paper available on the Social Science Research Network, free of charge and downloadable, which gives all the details of the equations you can implement your own spreadsheet model of this simple approach.
Having put these equations into a spreadsheet, we can ask some basic questions. Does this extremely simplified model of Keynes' original ideas produce realistic economic results? Does it, in fact, justify Keynes' original ideas? In particular, there are three questions we should look at. First, does the economy move to a new path after a shock, which is what Keynes believed? Or, as the classical economists believe, does it, like a pendulum, revert back to its original path after having absorbed the shock a few periods later? Secondly, does the economy necessarily, of its own accord, produce business cycles, as Keynes believed it did, but again, as classical economists believed would not happen? In fact, they believe business cycles are fundamentally impossible within the economy. They can only occur if some external shock happens to the economy to force a depression and perhaps a recovery from it. And thirdly, during a recession or after a shock which causes a recession, should the government intervene, or should it just let the economy do its own thing in the hope that it will recover? Keynes obviously believed the government should intervene because otherwise the economy would stay on a worse path. But the classical economists again disagreed and believed that the economy should left to be its own devices to recover. Well, we're going to investigate these things using the model. In order to use this original Keynesian model, we need to specify a few parameters. For example, one is how much does a change in spirits affect the desire to borrow and spend. So we have to put in a number of figures, parameters like that. Once we've done that, we can show here how the model specifies the development of the economy over time. You can see that the GDP level grows over time, but it doesn't do it linearly or in a nice smooth curve. It includes dips, periods of recession and periods of growth. Or, as we usually say, business cycles. Now here is what happens if we give the economy an external shock. And in this case, I've chosen to increase the price of goods by 25% over a 3-period time window. That's between periods 12 to 14 here. And you can see that what happens is that afterwards the economy moves on to a new development path. GDP is overall lower and the economy has fewer but larger recessions. This is exactly what Keynes thought. Shocks to the economy will affect its future path. There is no equilibrium position to which the economy will drift back. Now, the second thing we've already mentioned is that the model does produce business cycles with or without any external shocks. Business cycles are endogenous to this system. They're there as a result of debt levels growing and people needing to reduce debt, reducing spending, reducing investment, causing a recession until after a while things get back into kilter and the economy can grow again. Again, this is exactly what Keynes believed. And finally, if at the end of the 25% price increase shock, that is in period 14, we allow the government to act by increasing its spending by 12.5% in this case, we can see that the economy moves to yet another path, which, compared to the after-shock path, is an improvement. So government action can, obviously, if given at the right time and in the right amount, but increased spending from government action can improve the future path of the economy. Again, Keynes was right. Government action is necessary if we want the economy to proceed on a good path rather than a suboptimal one. Keynes, or at least Keynes' original thinking, has been neglected and is due for a revival. Current economic models have been unable to predict or deal with economic crises, and the legacy of Keynes is still there. The challenge to economists is to stop being locked into unrealistic classical thinking and to develop Keynes' critical insights. This is what we need, this is what the world needs, this is what the theory of macroeconomics needs.